Resuming debate. Reprise de débat. The Honourable Member for Beaches, East York.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to rise today to speak to Bill C-26 and its very long title. It's a bill that touches, Mr. Speaker, on a number of different pieces of legislation, the Criminal Code, the Canada Evidence Act, and it in fact enacts a high-risk child sex offender act, database act as well, and there are consequential amendments to other acts. We're at second reading here, Mr. Speaker, and it seems that we might as well support this bill through to committee so that we can hear from some experts on this subject. This act, Mr. Speaker, as suggested by its title, seeks to do a number of things. Increase the maximum penalties for violations on prohibition orders, probation orders, and peace bonds. It increases existing mandatory minimum penalties and maximum penalties for certain sexual offenses against children. Clarifies and codifies rules regarding the imposition of consecutive and concurrent sentences. Requires courts to impose, in certain cases, consecutive sentences on offenders who commit sexual offenses against children. It ensures that spouses of the accused are considered competent and compellable witnesses for the prosecution in child pornography cases. And it increases reporting obligations on sex offenders who travel outside Canada, and it establishes a high-risk Child Sex Offender Database Act and other things, Mr. Speaker. It's a far-reaching bill. Now, Mr. Speaker, what you'll note about this long list of acts and amendments to existing legislation is that it is more of what this government has in fact done in the past, more of turning the screws in the same direction. You'll note that this Conservative government in this and previous parliaments has already implemented new mandatory minimums for assaults where victims are under 16 years of age. It's identified grooming activities as criminal offense. It has made the use of computers and other telecommunications devices for the purpose of making arrangements to commit a sexual offense against a child. It's amended the sex offender registry already. It's increased the age at which a person can consent to sexual activity from 14 to 16. It's required Internet service providers to report child pornography, and it's increased sentencing and monitoring of dangerous offenders. And now, apart from the wisdom, Mr. Speaker, of any of this, the problem that confronts us in this bill here, in that context, is that the Minister of Justice has provided this information that sexual offenses have increased by 6% over the last 2 years. That statistic, Mr. Speaker, is offered by the Minister in support of further action, obviously, in support of this bill, but at least equally, if not more so, that statistic calls into question the approach taken by this government to date. It seems to suggest that mandatory minimums, longer maximums, increased scrutiny and surveillance via sex registry, and so on, may not be effective responses to this issue. And this is worrying, Mr. Speaker, because of the particular nature of this issue of child sexual assault or child sexual abuse. It is so incredibly harmful, hurtful, leaving lasting emotional and psychological scars on its victims, things that victims have to live with, cope with for their full lives, if they can or do in fact live out their full lives with the hurt caused. Mr. Speaker, I'm the son of two teachers, and when I grew up, chat around the dinner table was always about education and teaching and what's going on in the classroom. But I married a lawyer, a criminal lawyer, who did criminal defense work for 14 years before moving over to the Crown side, where she's been for 6 years. And there's been lots of stories brought home, Mr. Speaker, of crimes that she's had to be engaged in, either on the defense or prosecution side. Not happy stories, Mr. Speaker, and for the most part, not stories to be talked about around the dinner table. But there is a story, I think, that I'd like to tell that isn't related to the many stories I've heard through my wife, but through my own experience as a kid. I had the great fortune, Mr. Speaker, of growing up in a lovely, picturesque and historic Canadian town, and the downtown in particular is a beautiful place to live. It's the kind of older and largely more affluent part of the city, filled with old limestone houses occupied largely by professionals, doctors, lawyers, professors. But as it turns out, it was also the hunting ground of a child sex predator, the choir master at one of the local cathedrals. And he was a much trusted, highly respected person in the community, and taught music not only through the cathedral but to other kids in town as well. And I happened to be a member for a very brief time, because I don't have much of a voice, Mr. Speaker, of one of his non-secular choirs. But things started to come undone for the choir master in 1990. When two families in the congregation alleged publicly in stories in the local paper that the choir master had sexually molested their sons, and that abuse was directly linked to their sons' suicides. Both boys had hanged themselves, one as a teenager and the other as a young man working on his doctorate at an Ivy League university. One of those boys I played tennis with as a kid, Mr. Speaker, and the other went to nursery school with me. It's a small town. Ultimately, the choir master pled guilty to charges involving 13 boys over a 12-year period. Over time, Mr. Speaker, more victims came forward, making this story a much longer and ever more complicated one. In retelling the story, Mr. Speaker, there may be wounds that get reopened, but I want to use the story for this purpose, to point to the complicated social facts that surround such matters. The fact that it is a long and complicated story ought to give us all cause to pause and think through carefully our response to this issue. How does someone like this win the trust of both kids and parents? How does a predator like this find support even from some of his victims? How does he retain the loyalty and support of a significant portion of the congregation? How did he get pardoned at one point in time? How does he win the support of a new community and congregation? These are all questions that in the abstract need to be addressed if we are to protect kids from this kind of predatory behavior. We need to understand better how these things work, because most of this story is about the pain and harm caused to the kids, harm that includes the suicides of two young men full of great promise. So it seems useful, Mr. Speaker, to take this bill through to the committee so that we can have that discussion, in fact, so that we can call before the committee witnesses that can, based on their expertise and experience, speak to some of the issues that are raised in a case like this one that I've referred to today. And perhaps it's the case that some of what's in this bill is useful in the views of those who will testify before the committee, but the statistic, that of 6% increase in sexual offenses against children that the minister offers in support of C-26 as a response to this issue of child sexual abuse, assault, exploitation, suggests to me that we ought to be having a discussion at committee about other types of resources to counter the sexual abuse of children, other methods of prevention, other precautions to take, other forms or opportunities for education, both parents and kids. In the 2011 budget, Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives announced $250,000 in funding over 2 years as part of the federal victims strategy for programs to protect children. Budget 2012 included $7 million over 5 years to fund child advocacy centers, as well as limited funding for victim services organizations. This seems paltry in light of the scope and seriousness of the problem, but can the government tell us, Mr. Speaker, whether any of this was effective? We know by way of Steve Sullivan, the former federal ombudsman for the victims of crime, that the Circles of Support and Accountability program was very effective. That, Mr. Speaker, has been cut through cuts to Corrections Canada and National Crime Prevention Center. So in a hopeful moment, Mr. Speaker, a moment In anticipation of a good faith response by this Conservative government, it seems to me that it would be useful to put this bill and other thoughts and ideas before committee for the purpose of looking at the bill specifically, yes, but also at the issue more broadly with a view to thinking through what we can do as members of Parliament to prevent stories like that of this sexual predator that I told today, to prevent the harm that predators like him do to kids, to prevent the kind of pain that would cause two young men to take their own lives. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.